Hey guys, tonight we begin with Hitler's last desperate gamble in the West, a massive surprise attack that became the Battle of the Bulge, and a fascinating little story about how something as simple as a captured box of food can reveal why an entire army is doomed. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Welcome, everyone, to the Channel Historian Podcast. The morning of December 17th, 1944 was brutally cold in the forests of Belgium. The air was so cold it felt like breathing in tiny needles of ice, stinging the lungs and freezing the moisture in a man's beard instantly. In the small town square of Bullingen, SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper stood watching his men. Peiper was 30 years old, handsome in a severe way, and already a legend in the Waffen-SS, decorated by Hitler himself. He commanded Kampfgruppe Peiper, the armored spearhead of the 6th SS Panzer Army. His unit was a lethal collection of about 4,800 men and 117 tanks and assault guns, including the terrifying new 70-ton King Tiger tanks. His mission was brutally simple: punch a hole in the American lines, race west as fast as humanly possible, ignore any fighting on his flanks, seize the bridges over the Meuse River, and then drive on to the ultimate prize, the port of Antwerp. This audacious, almost insane plan had begun just over 30 hours earlier in the pre-dawn darkness of December 16th. Hitler had given it a typically deceptive name, Operation Wacht am Rhein, or Watch on the Rhine. It was the largest German offensive in the West since the fall of France in 1940. 3 full armies, 250,000 men, and over 1,400 tanks and assault guns had smashed into a weakly held 80-mile sector of the American front lines in the Ardennes forest. The goal was nothing less than to split the Allied armies in two, cut off the British and Canadians in the north, and force the Americans and British to negotiate a separate peace. It was a gamble of staggering proportions, Hitler's final roll of the dice, to change the course of the war. But this entire colossal enterprise, this vast movement of steel and men, was balanced on a knife edge. The problem, as it so often was for the German army, was fuel. The German High Command had managed to scrape together about 5 million gallons of gasoline for the entire offensive. Basic calculations, the kind any logistics officer could do on the back of an envelope, showed that the panzers needed at least twice that amount just to reach Antwerp, and that was assuming perfect conditions. The planners knew this. Hitler knew this. Their solution was not a solution at all. It was a desperate hope. The panzer divisions were ordered to capture American fuel depots along their route. They were to take what they needed from the enemy and keep moving. The success of the entire offensive depended not on German supplies, but on capturing American ones. Peiper's divisional intelligence officer had given him a map before the attack. The map was dotted with locations of known American supply installations, massive fuel dumps, ammunition depots, and ration supply points. The intelligence was accurate. The Americans, with their seemingly infinite resources, had supplies everywhere, often stacked mountains high close to the front. The only question was whether the Germans could get to them before the retreating Americans had time to destroy them. Bullingen was the very first test of this reckless strategy. Peiper's Kampfgruppe, after smashing through the initial American defenses, had taken the town at 07:30 that morning. The American defenders, part of the 99th Infantry Division, had been caught completely by surprise and had retreated so quickly they left almost everything behind. For Peiper, it was a miracle. The town's fuel depot was completely intact. It contained 50,000 gallons of American gasoline. It was enough, just enough, to refuel his entire spearhead and allow him to keep moving west. Now, in the frozen town square, an utterly bizarre scene was unfolding. American prisoners of war, their hands raw and stiff in the cold, were being forced at gunpoint to work the pumps. They were filling up American jerry cans with American fuel and passing them hand to hand in long lines to the waiting German panzers. The irony was bitter. The prisoners were fueling the very war machine that had just shattered their lines and killed their comrades. Peiper had ordered it himself. His own men were utterly exhausted. They had been fighting and driving for 36 straight hours with almost no sleep. The feeling of fatigue was a physical weight, a gritty, leaden exhaustion that pulled at their limbs and made their eyelids feel like stone. They needed to rest, eat, and maintain their vehicles. Letting the Americans pump their own fuel into German tanks was brutally efficient. It was also deeply humiliating for the prisoners, which Peiper, a man hardened by years of savage warfare on the Eastern Front, probably considered a useful psychological bonus. The fuel was flowing. Peiper watched the 5-gallon jerry cans being passed down the line. Each can was heavy, sloshing with the precious liquid. The smell of high-octane gasoline cut sharply through the cold air, overpowering the scent of pine and damp stone. 10 cans for a Panzer IV, maybe 20 for one of his monstrous King Tigers, which drank fuel at a rate of a gallon per mile. Multiply that by over 100 tanks and vehicles. It would take hours to refuel everything. Hours Peiper did not have. He was already behind schedule. Every minute his spearhead was stopped was a minute the Americans could use to recover from the initial shock, to move reinforcements, to organize a new line of defense. But without fuel, his panzers were just useless, immobile steel boxes. Peiper had learned that bitter lesson time and again on the endless plains of the Eastern Front. The best tank in the world, and he commanded the best tanks in the world, meant absolutely nothing when his gas tank was empty. The Wehrmacht in 1943 and 1944 had lost more vehicles to fuel shortages than to Soviet tanks or anti-tank guns. Entire panzer divisions had been immobilized, their tanks abandoned on the steppe, their positions overrun simply because the supply trucks could not get through. Now, here in Belgium, the exact same problem haunted him. German logistics, once the marvel of the world during the Blitzkrieg of 1940, had completely collapsed. The fuel that had been allocated for his offensive was stuck somewhere far behind his lines. The roads back to Germany were choked in colossal traffic jams. Allied fighter bombers, though currently grounded by the thick winter fog, would slaughter anything that moved on those roads the moment the skies cleared. The supply trucks were not coming. That meant Peiper had to capture American fuel, or his advance and Hitler's entire offensive would stop dead. Historians still debate whether the Ardennes offensive ever had a realistic chance of success. Many argue it was a doomed fantasy from the start, a product of Hitler's detachment from reality. Others suggest that with perfect luck, perfect weather, and the capture of all the Allied fuel, it might just have caused a major crisis for the Allies. But everyone agrees on one thing. Without captured fuel, it was absolutely impossible. One of his officers, Hauptsturmführer Noske, walked over, his breath pluming in the frigid air. Noske was Peiper's personal staff officer, a man who had been with him since the bloody campaigns in France and Russia. He was reliable, unflappable, and efficient. Noske reported that the fuel situation was, as they had discovered, both a blessing and a curse. The 50,000 gallons at Billingen were confirmed. It was a lifeline, enough to get the Kampfgruppe moving again, to get them perhaps as far as the town of Stavelot or maybe just beyond. But it was not the war-winning jackpot they truly needed. Peiper already knew this. His intelligence map, folded and worn, showed another, much larger depot at Stavelot. That was the real prize. The Americans would almost certainly defend it fiercely, or if they were smart, they would destroy it before he could get there. Either way, Peiper had to reach it, and he had to reach it fast. The refueling continued its agonizingly slow pace. Peiper walked through the captured depot, his tall frame cutting an imposing figure among the harried men. American supplies were stacked everywhere, a testament to an enemy that seemed to produce material with the careless ease of a god. There were crates of ammunition, stacks of medical supplies, boxes of rations, and piles of winter clothing. Everything was organized, everything was labeled, everything was abundant. He watched the American prisoners. They were young mostly, their faces a mixture of shock, terror, and sullen resentment. Their hands, many without gloves, were bright red and clumsy as they fumbled with the frozen metal handles of the jerry cans. The cold was a physical enemy, a constant draining pain. The steel of the cans felt like it was burning their skin, sticking to their flesh for a split second each time they grabbed one. They passed the heavy cans hand to hand, a miserable human chain. Their German guards, themselves gray-faced with exhaustion, shouted at them to move faster. The sound of their boots crunching on the snow-covered ground and the constant rhythmic clanking of metal jerry cans against each other provided a grim soundtrack to the scene. The air was thick with the overpowering odor of gasoline fumes and the oily stench of diesel exhaust from the idling Panzer engines. The massive tanks waited, their engines rumbling in a low, hungry vibration that seemed to shake the very ground. Peiper knew his own men were on the verge of collapse. They had pushed themselves beyond the limits of normal human endurance. The fatigue was a poison in their blood, making every movement a conscious effort of will. He saw them leaning against their vehicles, their eyes half closed, some huddled around small fires they had lit with captured American wood. They needed rest, but rest was a luxury he could not afford. This halt was a deadly risk. Momentum was his only armor. The entire premise of the offensive was speed, to hit the Americans so hard and so fast they would never have time to react. And here he was, stuck in a Belgian town square, his entire spearhead immobilized for hours, all for a lack of fuel. He felt a cold knot of frustration. This was the failure of the planners, the logistics staff, the entire German war machine. They had sent him on the most critical mission of the war with an empty gas tank. He was running an offensive on fumes and captured supplies. Historians still debate the true cost of this halt at Billingen. The 50,000 gallons were absolutely essential. Without them, Peiper's advance would have ended right there. But the hours spent laboriously refueling can by can gave the American commanders priceless time. Time to comprehend the scale of the attack, time to redirect units, time to begin setting up the very roadblocks and defenses that would soon bleed Peiper's Kampfgruppe dry. The fuel he gained was paid for with the time he lost. One of his tank commanders, SS Sturmbannführer Werner Pötschke, approached him. Pötschke, a hardened veteran of the 1st SS Panzer Battalion, reported his tanks were finally topped off. His men were eating, scrounging whatever they could from the captured American stores. Peiper nodded. He looked at the scene one last time. The American prisoners, the German guards, the mountains of captured goods. It was a snapshot of the war's absurdity. A high-tech German armored unit, the elite of the SS, being saved by the mundane logistical abundance of an enemy they despised. The entire operation felt less like a strategic masterpiece and more like a desperate smash-and-grab raid. And the worst part was, this was only the first stop. The 50,000 gallons felt less like a victory and more like a temporary reprieve, just enough fuel to get to the next crisis. Peiper made a decision. They could not wait for every single vehicle to be perfectly full. The lead elements were ready. They had to move. Peiper walked over to the stacks of captured American supplies while the last of the panzers finished refueling. The noise of the engines was a constant, deep vibration you felt in your chest, and the air was thick with the acrid smell of diesel exhaust and raw gasoline. He kicked at a wooden crate, then bent down and picked up one of the small brown cardboard boxes. The label was printed in plain black letters: K-ration, meal, combat, individual, breakfast unit. He had seen them before, of course, but now, in this moment of critical pause, he took the time to actually examine one. The box was coated in wax, making it waterproof, a simple, clever detail. It was compact, designed to fit in a soldier's pocket. When he broke the seal and opened it, inside was not just a block of hard bread and a piece of sausage, which is what a German soldier might expect. It was a complete engineered system. There was a small, flat can of chopped ham and eggs, a packet of hard biscuits, a 2-ounce D-ration chocolate bar formulated to survive high temperatures, a pack of 4 cigarettes, a packet of instant coffee powder, 3 sugar tablets, a stick of chewing gum, a small wooden spoon, a book of matches, and even a small roll of toilet paper. It was a marvel of industrial packaging. He picked up the small can of ham and eggs. It was sealed tight, the contents preserved, ready to eat. The biscuits were wrapped in cellophane. The chocolate he knew from prisoners was dense and rich, not the chalky ersatz sugar and sawdust mix that German civilians and soldiers sometimes received. It was all so clean, so organized, so abundant. Peiper, a man who had commanded frontline combat units since the invasion of Poland in 1939, knew precisely what his own soldiers received as rations. The standard German field ration, when it actually arrived at the front, required a field kitchen. It was distributed in bulk, big containers of stew or soup, bread that was often days old and rock hard, and meat that was mostly fat and gristle. The quality had been getting steadily worse since the disaster at Stalingrad in 1943. By late 1944, frontline units were lucky to get one hot meal a day. Many survived on whatever they could scavenge. Peiper's own Kampfgruppe, the elite SS spearhead, had left Germany with only 3 days of rations. Those were long gone. For the past 36 hours, his men had been eating captured American food or food they had taken from Belgian civilians. Some units, when they got truly desperate, had been forced to slaughter their own supply horses. He looked at the K-ration box in his hand. The contrast was stunning. He found the manufacture date stamped on the bottom of the box. It read, October 1944. This meal was barely 2 months old. The American industrial machine was producing these things so fast and in such vast quantities that rations manufactured just weeks ago were already here at the front lines in the pockets of their soldiers. His staff officer, Noski, walked over, wiping his hands on a greasy rag. Peiper handed him the opened K-ration box. Noski, a practical man, looked it over with open curiosity. He found the tiny, clever can opener that was sometimes included, though often soldiers used their own. He pried open the flat can of chopped ham and eggs. He sniffed it. It smelled like preserved meat, salty and savory. He then used the small wooden spoon from the kit and scooped out a bite, eating it cold right there in the freezing town square. Noski's eyebrows shot up. He chewed thoughtfully, his face a mask of surprise. He swallowed and took another bigger bite, and the food was good. It was not a feast, but it was real, palatable food, ready to eat, no cooking required. It was better than any cold ration German soldiers had eaten in months. Noski then looked at the other items in the box, his surprise turning into something like disbelief. Real coffee, not the roasted acorn ersatz substitute they drank. Real chocolate. American cigarettes, and the small, almost frivolous luxuries, the matches, the toilet paper, the chewing gum. Historians still debate the specific long-term nutritional adequacy of the K-ration. Many GIs found it monotonous and complained it lacked the calories for sustained frontline combat. But its psychological impact, both on the Americans who had it and the Germans who captured it, is undisputed. It was a tangible symbol of a system that worked, a system of overwhelming supply. Peiper said nothing. He was already doing the math in his head. If every American soldier received 3 of these little boxes per day, that was 3 complete self-contained meals. If there were, say, 10 million American soldiers in uniform around the world, that meant 30 million of these individual, perfectly packaged meal boxes were being produced, shipped, and distributed every single day. 900 million per month. The industrial capacity required to do that, to source the food, process it, package it in waterproof cardboard and cellophane, ship it 3,000 miles across an ocean, and then deliver it to a single soldier in a foxhole in Belgium, was simply staggering. Germany, even at the peak of its power in 1941, had never produced anything on that scale. The entire German armaments industry under Albert Speer had been mobilized for total war. They produced brilliant tanks, advanced aircraft, and oceans of ammunition, but they could not produce enough food to properly feed their own soldiers. And here, the Americans were packaging individual meals in waterproof boxes with little luxuries like chewing gum. It was more than just food. It was a weapon of industrial warfare. Noski pointed out something else, his voice low. The depot, this one small, almost insignificant supply dump in a town Peiper had never heard of, had hundreds of these ration boxes, perhaps thousands. And this was just one supply point, one tiny node in a logistical network that stretched back across France, across the vast Atlantic Ocean, to factories in places like Ohio or Michigan, places Peiper could not even properly imagine. How many depots just like this did the Americans have? How much food? How much of everything? Peiper had fought the Soviets on the Eastern Front for years. He had seen Soviet logistics. It was crude, messy, and brutal, but it was terrifyingly effective. It was a logistics of sheer, overwhelming mass, endless columns of simple, rugged trucks, entire factories evacuated from the West and rebuilt in the Urals far beyond the reach of German bombers. The Soviets, he knew, could replace their losses faster than Germany could inflict them. It was a war of attrition they were destined to win, but even Soviet logistics looked primitive compared to this. The Soviets moved supplies in bulk, barrels of fuel, sacks of potatoes, crates of ammunition. The Americans, it seemed, packaged everything. Everything was individualized. The Soviets used quantity. The Americans used quantity and quality. Peiper looked closely at the packaging again, feeling the waxy, water-resistant coating. Every item he examined showed careful, deliberate engineering. The cellophane on the biscuits, the compact, flat design of the cans, the long shelf life. This was not some emergency improvisation, a response to a crisis. This was industrial planning on a global, almost astronomical scale. The smell of the chemicals from the waterproofing wax was faint but sharp, a sterile, manufactured scent that was completely different from the earthy, often rotting smell of German supply dumps. Peiper thought of his own men. Their rations were a constant source of complaint when they arrived at all. The bread, the infamous German Kommissbrot, was a dense, dark rye loaf that was nutritious but often stale and hard as wood. Their tinned meat was a greasy, fatty mystery mix that required cooking to be even remotely palatable. Their coffee was a bitter joke made from roasted acorns or barley, and luxuries like real chocolate or cigarettes, those were reserved for the rear echelon staff or for lucky finds on the black market. Here, the Americans were issuing them as standard equipment. It's like finding out the guy you are in a fistfight with is also a billionaire who owns the hospital you are both going to end up in. It just takes the wind out of your sails. Historians still debate just how aware the German high command was of the true scale of American industrial production. Some evidence suggests they knew the numbers but refused to believe them, dismissing them as Allied propaganda. They simply could not comprehend that a nation could produce so much material. Peiper was an intelligent man. He was not just a blunt instrument despite his reputation for battlefield brutality. He understood exactly what he was looking at. He was not just holding a breakfast. He was holding the reason Germany was losing the war. He was holding tangible proof that this offensive, this great desperate lunge through the Ardennes, was ultimately pointless. Even if he reached the Meuse River, even if he somehow made it all the way to Antwerp, what then? This endless river of supplies would just keep flowing. The Americans would just land more men, more tanks, and more boxes of chopped ham and eggs. They could replace every single loss, while every German loss, every man and every tank was permanent. A wave of profound weariness washed over Peiper, a fatigue that had nothing to do with the last 36 hours of fighting. It was a cold, deep exhaustion of the soul. He felt the rough, waxed cardboard of the K-ration box in his gloved hand. It was solid, real, and heavy with implication. The cold air suddenly felt even colder, seeping into his greatcoat, making his bones ache. He was fighting an enemy that could package and deliver comfort itself. Just then, SS Sturmbannführer Werner Pochke arrived, his face smudged with dirt and engine grease. Pochke commanded what was left of the 1st SS Panzer Battalion. He had lost tanks during the breakthrough and was desperate for resupply. Pochke looked like he had just crawled out of a chimney, which, to be fair, was probably warmer than standing out here. He reported his battalion was running low on everything: fuel, ammunition, and most critically, food. Peiper told him the fuel was being distributed now. That was the good news. Ammunition would have to come from captured American stocks. They had found crates of American 75mm shells that, with a bit of luck, could be fired from some of the German guns, a battlefield improvisation that screamed desperation. "Take what you need," Peiper ordered. "Keep moving." Pochke then asked about food. His men had not had a proper meal since the day before the offensive began. They were running on adrenaline and stale bread. The noise of the refueling was finally dying down. The last of the panzers were full. The shouting of the guards and the clanging of the jerry cans subsided, replaced by the low, anxious murmur of men preparing to move out. The square was littered with the debris of the captured depot, empty crates, discarded wrappers, and the dark, glistening stains of spilled gasoline on the snow. Peiper pointed with his chin toward the massive stacks of captured rations. He told Poetchki they were American K-rations. He ordered him to tell his men to take as many as they could carry. They should eat now, eat while they could, and stuff their pockets and vehicles with more. There was no telling when or if the next German supply opportunity would come. Germany's elite SS Panzertruppen were about to be fueled by America's finest processed ham. You really cannot write this stuff. Poetchki, a man who had seen comrades vaporized in Russia, just stared at the stacks of little brown boxes for a second. He then grabbed several, his rough hands fumbling with the waxed cardboard, and walked back to his tank crews. The men, huddled against the steel flank of their Panther tank, trying to leach some warmth from the engine, looked up with hollow, red-rimmed eyes. When they saw the American boxes, there was a flicker of curiosity, but mostly just weariness. Then they opened them. The reaction was immediate and profound. These men were veterans, hardened survivors of the Eastern Front. They were used to hardship, to starvation, to eating things a civilian would not feed to a dog. They tore open the cellophane-wrapped biscuits and bit into them. They were hard, yes, but they were not the rock-like, sawdust-filled kamas brat they were used to. They opened the small cans of chopped ham and eggs, sniffing them suspiciously, and then ate the contents cold. A low murmur of disbelief passed through the crews. It was real food. It tasted good, or at least it tasted like what it said it was. The salty, processed meat was a luxury beyond words. They found the instant coffee packets, and some men managed to get hold of heated water from their engine radiators, mixing the dark powder into a steaming, fragrant brew. The smell of real coffee, not the bitter acorn ersatz sludge, filled the air, mingling with the heavy stench of diesel. For a few minutes, the frozen town square in Billingen became a bizarre, surreal cafeteria. Hardened SS tankers, men with reputations for appalling brutality, sat on their panzers, carefully spooning American ham and eggs from a can and sipping American coffee. The sudden rush of sugar from the D-ration chocolate bars hit their starved bodies like a jolt of electricity. It was a strange, fleeting moment of pleasure in a landscape of utter destruction. One soldier joked darkly that if their wives in Germany could cook like this, they would have won the war already. It was a weak joke, but it drew a few dry coughs of laughter. The warmth of the hot coffee spread through their chests, a temporary defense against the biting cold that seemed to live in their bones. The feeling of the hot metal cup burning their gloved hands was a welcome sensation, a reminder that they were still alive. But the pause was brief. They ate with the desperate speed of men who knew their next meal was not guaranteed. They stuffed the extra chocolate bars, the cigarettes, the chewing gum into the deep pockets of their parkas. These were more than food. They were currency, valuable items to be bartered or saved. Peiper watched this scene unfold. He saw his elite soldiers, the supposed Aryan supermen, marveling over the enemy's standard-issue rations. It confirmed everything he had just been thinking. His men were treating these emergency field rations like a Christmas feast because compared to what the German Reich could provide them, the logistical gap was not a gap, it was a chasm, and he was standing on the wrong side of it. The refueling was finally complete around 09:30. The last jerry can was handed up, the last engine was topped off. The American prisoners were herded back into a cold building under guard, their work done. The brief, strange interlude was over. Peiper gave the order to move out. The sound changed instantly. The low, rumbling idle of dozens of engines roared to life. The deep-throated cough of the Maybach engines and the Panthers and Tigers vibrated through the stone buildings of the square. The ground itself seemed to tremble. The Kampfgruppe began to uncoil itself, forming into a long march column. The heavy tanks went first, the massive King Tigers and the formidable Panthers leading the way. Their tracks, wide as a man's torso, bit into the snow-covered road, the rhythmic clack, clack, clack of metal on stone echoing through the town. Behind them came the Panzer IVs and the assault guns, followed by the armored half-tracks carrying the Panzer Grenadiers, the infantry who would have to fight for every village and bridge. Last came the support vehicles, the fuel trucks now carrying American gasoline, the ammunition carriers, and the mobile aid stations. The column stretched for several kilometers, a long gray-green snake of steel winding its way out of Billingen. Peiper climbed into his own command vehicle. an armored half-track. The route led northwest towards the town of Stavelot. It was only 14 kilometers away. On a good road at speed, they could cover that distance in 20 minutes. But the roads were not good. They were choked with mud, slushy snow, and the wreckage of the initial fighting. There were abandoned American vehicles, overturned carts from fleeing refugees, and craters from artillery, and the Americans, though retreating, were fighting back. Every village would have to be cleared. Every bridge had to be checked for demolition charges. Peiper's intelligence map showed the major fuel depot at Stavelot. That was the prize. Bühlingen was just an appetizer. Stavelot, intelligence promised, held the main course, perhaps millions of gallons. Enough to get him not just to the Meuse, but maybe, just maybe, beyond. The column lurched forward, leaving the relative safety of the captured town for the uncertain dangers of the road ahead. The Kampfgruppe reached the outskirts of Stavelot around 1200 hours, midday. The town was nestled uncomfortably on both sides of the Amblive River, a dark, fast-flowing ribbon of water that cut through the valley. A solid-looking stone bridge sat in the center of the town, connecting the two halves. This was the choke point. Peiper's lead tank slowed as they approached. The optimism from Bühlingen, fueled by captured gasoline and ham, began to evaporate. This did not look like another easy rope-over. American forces were defending the bridge. These were not the shocked, disorganized troops they had overrun hours earlier. These men were dug in. The first crack of an American anti-tank gun split the air, the sound sharp and vicious echoing off the stone houses. The shell clanged harmlessly off the thick frontal armor of the lead Panther, but it was a clear message. The welcome wagon was not out. Peiper's lead tanks immediately returned fire. The deafening boom of their 75mm guns was a physical punch to the chest. Huge clouds of dust and stone erupted where the shells struck. Machine guns opened up, the high, rapid brrrt of the German MG-42s contrasting with the slower, heavier thump, thump, thump of the American Brownings. The battle for Stavelot had begun, and it would last for 3 agonizing hours. Peiper's forces were forced to deploy and fight. This was exactly what he did not want to do. Every minute spent fighting for a town was a minute not spent racing toward the Meuse, but the bridge was a bottleneck. He could not go around it. He had to go through it. His panzer grenadiers dismounted from their half-tracks, their boots hitting the frozen, muddy ground. They fanned out, moving in sharp, low bursts from doorway to doorway, using the stone buildings for cover. The air quickly filled with the acrid, sulphurous stench of cordite and burning wood as houses began to catch fire. The cold was still bitter, but the men were sweating under their heavy winter gear, the adrenaline of combat creating its own furnace. They felt the rough, icy stone of the houses against their backs as they pressed themselves flat, waiting for a chance to move. The Americans fought back stubbornly. They had anti-tank guns well sighted to cover the bridge approaches. Bazooka teams lurked in upper-story windows, waiting for a panzer to expose its thinner side armor. It was a nasty, grinding fight, street by street. A German Panther tank nosed around a corner, its massive gun traversing, hunting. The sound of its engine was a deep, menacing growl. It fired, and the entire building in front of it seemed to dissolve into a cloud of pulverized brick and timber. It was like watching a giant with a sledgehammer. But the Americans were not intimidated. They hit one of the Panzer IVs with a bazooka round, striking its track. The tank lurched to a halt, immobilized, one track dangling uselessly. The crew bailed out, scrambling for cover under a hail of machine gun fire. This was taking too long. Peiper was furious. His timetable was in ruins. His plan to be at the Meuse by nightfall was now a complete fantasy. He needed this bridge. Finally, after 3 hours of relentless pressure, the sheer weight of German armor and firepower began to tell. The American defenders started to fall back, retreating across the bridge to the western bank of the river. Peiper's grenadiers, sensing the enemy was breaking, surged forward, firing as they ran. As the last Americans scrambled across, there was a loud whump. A cloud of smoke and debris erupted from the bridge. The Americans had tried to blow it. Peiper's heart must have stopped. If that bridge was gone, his offensive was over. He would be trapped on the east bank of the Amblive, his spearhead broken. But when the smoke cleared, the bridge was still standing. The explosion had been weak, disorganized. It had scarred the stonework, maybe thrown a few chunks into the river, but the structure itself was intact. The charges had failed to detonate properly. It was another miracle, or perhaps just another example of battlefield chaos. German engineers, braving sniper fire, sprinted onto the bridge. They ran low, their bodies tense, expecting it to go up at any second. They checked the structure, frantically cutting any wires they found, kicking aside unexploded charges. They signaled back to Peiper. It was not demolished. It was intact. It was usable. Historians still debate exactly why the demolition failed so spectacularly. Some argue the American engineers were given the order too late, and in their haste, they failed to place the charges correctly. Others suggest the charges themselves were faulty, perhaps frozen or waterlogged. And some claim that Peiper's attack was simply so fast and ferocious that it disrupted the defenders before they could execute the demolition properly. Honestly, knowing how military operations go, it's entirely possible the instruction manual was in triplicate and they lost page 2. Whatever the reason, the failure was Peiper's salvation. Without that bridge, Kampfgruppe Peiper would have been finished. The feeling of the cold wind whipping across the open river on the bridge was invigorating. It cleared the smoke and stench of the battle from their lungs. Peiper gave the order. The column surged forward again, tanks and half-tracks clattering across the stone bridge and entering the western part of Stavelot. They had the town, or at least they had passed through it. They had lost men, they had lost tanks, and worst of all, they had lost 3 precious hours, but they were across the river. Now only one thing mattered. Peiper's men began to search the town and its outskirts. They were not looking for American soldiers anymore. They were looking for gasoline. The intelligence said it was here. A massive depot, maybe millions of gallons. Peiper was probably dreaming of jerry cans at this point. His panzers were thirstier than a college fraternity on a Friday night, and he had a very long way to go. The fate of the entire offensive once again rested on finding the enemy's supplies. Peiper's units fanned out as soon as they were clear of the main town on the western bank. The immediate threat from the American defenders had faded, replaced by a much more desperate, gnawing anxiety. The fight for the bridge had cost them dearly in time, and now every second counted. Peiper sent reconnaissance teams in all directions, armored cars and half-tracks roaring up the roads leading north and west out of Stavelot. Their orders were explicit. Forget about pockets of American resistance. Forget about securing the town. Find the fuel. The intelligence had been so specific. It was supposed to be here, near Stavelot, a major depot, one of the primary supply dumps for the American First Army. Peiper was expecting something like Bullingen, only much, much larger. He was looking for vast stacks of 55-gallon drums, or perhaps even large permanent storage tanks. He expected to see a sprawling complex, probably with guard towers, vehicle parks, and loading docks. He was looking for a German-style depot, a formal, obvious piece of military infrastructure. His men searched with a frantic energy. They stormed into barns, kicking open doors, expecting to find them stacked to the rafters with jerry cans. They drove up and down side roads, their eyes scanning the fields and forests on either side. They even grabbed a few terrified Belgian civilians who had been hiding in their cellars, dragging them out into the cold and demanding in broken French and harsh German, "Où est le pétrole? Where is the gasoline?" The civilians, pale and trembling, knew nothing. They just wanted the terrifying men in black uniforms to leave. The air was filled with the rumble of idling engines, a sound that was becoming maddening to Peiper. Every minute his panzer sat still, they were uselessly burning the last few precious gallons of the fuel they had captured at Bullingen. The acrid smell of their exhaust mingled with the damp, earthy scent of the river valley and the lingering, sharp smell of cordite from the earlier battle. The cold was a constant biting presence, seeping through their uniforms, making their hands stiff and clumsy. It was a miserable, frustrating search. The reconnaissance teams began to return one by one, their reports all the same. Nothing, they had found nothing. No massive depot, no stacks of barrels, no fuel trucks, nothing. It was as if the depot had vanished into thin air. Peiper could not believe it. How could the intelligence be so wrong? A supply dump holding millions of gallons was not something you could just misplace. It was an enormous installation. He sent the teams out again. Look harder. Check every building. Check the woods. It had to be somewhere, but the results were the same. The sun was already beginning to sink in the overcast sky, the gray light turning weaker, promising an early, frigid dusk. Peiper's entire advance, the central pillar of the 6th SS Panzer Army's attack, was grinding to a halt in a small Belgian town, all because of an intelligence failure. Historians still debate why Peiper's reconnaissance failed so completely. Some argue his men were simply too exhausted after nearly 2 days of continuous combat to conduct a thorough search. They were tankers and infantry, not scouts, and they were looking for something obvious, not something hidden. Others suggest the intelligence map was vague, marking the general area of Stavelot, but not the precise location. And some believe Peiper himself was too fixated on speed, too impatient to conduct the kind of slow, methodical search that was required. At 1500 hours, 3 hours after they had first reached the town, one of his reconnaissance officers did report finding some American supply dumps north of Stavelot. Peiper's hopes surged for a moment, but the officer quickly clarified. It was just a few small caches, jerrycans scattered along the roadsides, probably abandoned by retreating American units, maybe a few thousand gallons in total. It was something, but it was not the main depot. It was not the war-winning prize. It was just enough to be tantalizing, a hint of the logistical abundance that was supposedly here, but not enough to solve his problem. Peiper had to make a decision. The fuel depot, he concluded, either did not exist, or the Americans, in the hours he had spent fighting for the bridge, had already evacuated it or destroyed it. Either way, it was not here for the taking. He could not wait any longer. His Kampfgruppe had just enough fuel to continue the advance. Not much, but enough to get to the next town, maybe the town after that. The mission was to reach the Meuse River. Every hour he spent here searching for a ghost depot was an hour wasted. He gave the order, move on. At 1600 hours, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Kampfgruppe Peiper departed Stavelot and continued its push west. The engines roared back to life, the sound echoing flatly in the damp, cold valley. The men were grim, the frustration of the failed search palpable. They were moving again, but they were still running on fumes, their fuel gauges dropping steadily toward empty. Behind them, as the last German vehicle cleared the town, American engineers cautiously moved back into position. They had been watching from the wooded hills above the town, biding their time. Once the German column had passed, they re-secured the approaches to the bridge. Stavelot would not fall completely. The Americans would hold the southern bank of the river, creating a persistent threat to Peiper's long exposed flank. But Peiper was oblivious to this. He was focused on the road ahead. What Peiper did not know, and what would become one of the most agonizing ironies of the entire offensive, was that the fuel depot existed. It was there, and it was gigantic. It was not a few thousand gallons. It was 200,000 gallons of high-octane gasoline. This colossal, war-winning supply of fuel was stored in 5-gallon jerry cans, the very same kind they had so laboriously used at Billingen. The cans were stacked in immense, shoulder-high pyramids, stretching for 5 miles along a secondary road, and this road, Depot Number 2 and Depot Number 3, was located just 800 feet north of the main road Peiper had used to approach Stavelot. At one point, his column had driven past 2 million gallons of fuel, separated from it by only 300 yards of trees and open ground. He had literally driven right past it and never saw it. The Americans had not hidden the depot. They had not camouflaged it, not in any sophisticated way. And the jerry cans were stacked in plain sight along the roadside, thousands upon thousands of them, a river of gasoline. But Peiper and his scouts had missed it completely. They missed it because they were looking for the wrong thing. Peiper expected a fuel depot to look like a German fuel depot. He was searching for large permanent storage tanks, pumping stations, brick buildings, vehicle parks, and infrastructure. He was looking for something organized, fortified, and obvious. The American depot was none of those things. It was just fuel. It was stacked in portable containers, ready to be distributed wherever it was needed. There were no permanent buildings, no major guards, no complex infrastructure. It was the K-ration philosophy applied to gasoline. It was simple, efficient, abundant, and flexible. It was a logistical system that did not waste time building permanent structures when all that mattered was getting the fuel to the front. Peiper's column rolled past this unbelievable prize, his men smelling only the damp pine of the Ardennes when they should have been overwhelmed by the scent of 3 million gallons of gasoline. The sheer quantity of it sitting in the open would have been a beacon to anyone who knew what to look for, but they were looking for towers and tanks, not cans stacked by a road. After the war, an American Army historian named Major Ken Heckler, who was conducting interviews with captured German officers, had the chance to speak with Peiper. Heckler laid out a map and told Peiper about the depot. 3 million gallons, he said, just 300 yards from your route. Peiper, a man who was by then facing a death sentence for war crimes, reportedly just shrugged. He said he had expected the fuel to be piled up in the town square, just as it had been at Billingen. When he did not find it in the center of Stavelot, he simply assumed the Americans had moved it. He never thought to look in the surrounding woods. That one missed depot, that one failure of reconnaissance changed everything. It is not an exaggeration to say the Battle of the Bulge was lost for the Germans at that moment. With 2 million gallons of fuel, Peiper could have refueled his entire Kampfgruppe multiple times over. He could have refueled other German units following behind him. He could have driven with near impunity, his tanks full, all the way to the Meuse River and beyond. The crippling fuel crisis that eventually bled his spearhead dry and stopped the entire German offensive would simply not have existed, but Peiper never found it, and without that fuel, his advance and Hitler's last great gamble was already doomed. He just did not know it yet. Peiper's column rumbled west, away from the ghost depot at Stavelot. The mood in the vehicles was no longer optimistic. It was grim. The fuel gauges were now the primary enemy, the needle on each one dipping lower and lower. The momentum of the first 36 hours, that shocking, unstoppable breakthrough, was completely gone. Now every kilometer was paid for in blood and in precious, irreplaceable fuel. The Americans were no longer surprised, they were organized, and they were angry. Reinforcements were flooding the sector, especially from the battle-hardened 30th Infantry Division, a tough unit known as Old Hickory. They were not running. They were setting up roadblocks. They were blowing bridges right in Peiper's face, and they were sighting their anti-tank guns with deadly accuracy on every good piece of ground. Peiper's glorious race had devolved into a slow, brutal, grinding push. The men in the half-tracks felt the change. The atmosphere was no longer exultant. It was thick with a tense, waiting silence. The constant, agonizing tension of listening for the next sharp crack of an anti-tank gun was a physical ache in their shoulders. The cold was a living enemy. It made the steel of their vehicles painful to touch, a deep, penetrating chill that no amount of clothing could stop. Their feet felt like numb, useless blocks of ice, and the air inside the armored compartment was thick with the smell of their own unwashed bodies, stale sweat, old fear, and cigarette smoke. Peiper tried to push through the town of Trois Ponts, but the Americans blew the bridges just as his lead tanks approached. He was forced to reroute, a costly detour that consumed yet more time and more fuel. He finally fought his way into the small village of Stoumont on December 19th after another vicious firefight. But taking Stoumont was not a victory, it was a trap. American forces, counterattacking with ferocious determination, had swung around his long, thin column. They cut the road behind him at La Glade and Cheneux, and just like that, Kampfgruppe Peiper, the mighty spearhead of Hitler's offensive, was surrounded. They were cut off, a small island of German steel in a sea of American forces. The situation deteriorated with astonishing speed. The hunter was now the hunted. Peiper set up his command post in a solid-looking stone house in Stoumont, but the village was now under constant heavy American artillery fire. The shells came screaming in one after another, the terrible rising shriek followed by a ground-shaking crump that shattered stone and glass and sent shrapnel whining through the streets. It was a miserable, desperate fight. The Germans, so accustomed to being on the attack, were now frantically digging in, trying to create defensive positions. Peiper's terrifying King Tigers, the most powerful tanks in the world, were now just very expensive, very large, and very immobile pillboxes. They had just enough fuel to move from one side of the village to the other to meet a new threat, but not nearly enough to break out of the encirclement. It was the Ardennes equivalent of owning a Ferrari that is permanently stuck in a very small, very hostile parking garage. Inside Stoumont, a pocket of Americans from the 30th Infantry Division was still fighting. Major Hal McCown commanded the 2nd Battalion 119th Infantry Regiment. He and his men had been holding their ground in the town when Peiper's tanks first rolled in. Now they were cut off too, a pocket of American resistance trapped inside a German pocket. By December 21st, McCown's situation was completely hopeless. He was running out of ammunition, his men were exhausted, and the Germans were everywhere. McCown crouched in the damp, frigid cellar of a Belgian house. The air was thick and choked with the dust of pulverized plaster, and it carried the sickeningly sweet metallic smell of blood from the wounded men lying in the darkness. The wounded were groaning, their sounds muffled by the constant thump, thump, thump of mortar rounds landing just outside. Above them, he could hear the heavy, menacing tread of a German tank rolling past, the clank, clank, clank of its tracks so close it shook dust from the ceiling beams onto their faces. It was the sound of complete, unavoidable defeat. At 14:30 hours, 2:30 in the afternoon, German infantry stormed his command post. It was a short, brutal, chaotic firefight. There was shouting in German, the explosive bark of machine pistols, and the smell of cordite filled the confined space. One of McCown's men was killed. McCown and several of his staff were captured. The German soldiers, their faces gray with exhaustion and caked with battle grime, searched them roughly. The wool of their uniforms was damp and abrasive, and they smelled strongly of old sweat, gun oil, and the rank, sour smell of adrenaline. The hands that searched him were freezing cold, yet they moved with a practiced impersonal speed, emptying his pockets in seconds. They took his weapons, his maps, and his personal items, his watch, his cigarettes, anything of value. McCown was then marched through the ruined street to another damaged stone house on the edge of Stoumont. This was Peiper's command post. The house was a wreck, its windows shattered and boarded up, its walls pockmarked by shrapnel. Inside, German officers were clustered around a map table, their voices low and tense. They were no longer planning an advance. They were planning a defense. Historians still debate the exact nature of McCown's initial treatment. McCown himself would later testify that his treatment was generally correct under the Geneva Convention, but the situation was chaotic. His captors were desperate men, part of a unit already infamous for the massacre of American prisoners at Malmedy just a few days earlier. McCown was probably expecting to be shot. Being captured by the Waffen-SS was not like winning a lottery unless the prize was a very unpleasant, very cold, and very short remainder of the war. Peiper was standing near the map table. He looked up as the American major was brought in. Peiper was tall, thin, just 30 years old, with sharp, aristocratic features that looked strangely clean and out of place in the filthy, chaotic command post. He saw McCown's rank. They were both professional soldiers, battalion commanders. Peiper, who spoke perfect, almost unaccented English, walked over. He introduced himself. He asked McCown his name, his unit, and his position. This must have been a surreal moment for McCown. One minute he was fighting for his life in a cellar. The next he was being politely introduced to the bogeyman of the Ardennes, who sounded like he was about to offer him a cup of tea. McCown, following protocol, gave his name, rank, and serial number. Peiper, surprisingly, did not press him for tactical information. He seemed less interested in interrogating McCown and more interested in simply talking. The battle was raging just outside the walls. His command was disintegrating. He was surrounded, and he was completely out of fuel, and Joachim Peiper, in that moment of total crisis, decided it was a good time for a chat. That night, the battle for Stoumont raged, but inside the wrecked command post, a strange calm descended. Peiper and McCown sat in a small room, the windows covered with boards that did little to muffle the sounds of war. The constant rhythmic thump of American artillery landing on the German positions was a backdrop to everything, a sound you felt in your bones as much as you heard. The air in the room was cold and sharp, smelling of damp plaster, old smoke, and the metallic tang of expended ammunition. Peiper and McCown, the captor and the captive, two battalion commanders of the same rank, began to talk, and they talked for 7 hours. From 2300 hours, 11 at night, until 0500 hours the next morning, as the battle raged around their small, fragile island of conversation. Peiper, it turned out, did most of the talking, and he was not talking about military tactics. He was not trying to extract information from McCown. He was, to McCown's utter bewilderment, defending National Socialism. He was explaining in articulate, educated, and perfect English why Germany was fighting, why their cause was just, and why, despite the overwhelming evidence just outside the window, Germany was absolutely going to win the war. McCown, A professional soldier from the American South, mostly just listened. This was, to put it mildly, one of the weirdest prisoner experiences in World War II. It is like getting pulled over for speeding and the cop proceeds to give you a 4-hour lecture on his personal economic theories. You just sit there, nod politely, and hope you do not say the wrong thing. McCown later said that he had met very few men who impressed him so much in so short a time. Peiper was not a raving, animalistic brute, at least not in this moment. He was intelligent, charismatic, and seemingly possessed of an unbreakable, fanatic confidence. He talked about the Eastern Front, about the fight against Bolshevism, about the decadent nature of the Western Allies. He spoke with the fervor of a true believer. As the hours ticked by, the small room grew thick with their breath fogging in the cold and the increasing fug of Peiper's cigarette smoke. The lantern on the map table cast long, dancing shadows that made the room feel even more confined, more unreal. McCown was exhausted, the kind of deep cellular exhaustion that comes from days of combat, capture, and acute, life-threatening stress. The fatigue was a heavy, leaden cloak, and listening to this articulate, handsome, and utterly deluded SS commander's monologue must have felt like a bizarre fever dream. The true purpose of this 7-hour conversation is a matter of intense academic debate. Historians still debate what Peiper was really doing. Was he genuinely trying to convert this captured American officer to his worldview? Was he, in a moment of extreme stress, simply talking to keep his own fears at bay? Or was it something more calculated? Some historians suggest that Peiper, an intelligent man who could surely see the maps and hear the artillery, knew his situation was hopeless. This monologue might have been an attempt to justify himself, to create a record, to explain his actions to an enemy peer who might one day repeat his words. It was part propaganda, part confession, and part the delusional rambling of a man whose entire fanatical worldview was crashing down around him. Yet McCown's testimony is clear. Peiper showed no sign of doubt. He was completely, utterly convinced of eventual German victory, even as his Kampfgruppe was being systematically torn to pieces, even as he was surrounded, and even as his world-beating tanks sat immobilized just outside, useless metal sculptures with empty gas tanks. This was the profound contradiction. The man's words projected absolute victory. The reality of the tactical map in front of him screamed total defeat. He was like a man in a burning house calmly explaining that everything was fine and that fire was actually very good for the structural integrity of the wood. The conversation finally wound down as the first miserable gray light of dawn on December 22nd began to creep through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. The light was weak, barely illuminating the exhausted, stubble-covered faces of the German staff officers sleeping at their posts. The artillery had slackened for a moment, and the resulting silence felt heavy and unnatural. Peiper was done talking. McCown was led away, his mind reeling. He would spend the next 3 days as a prisoner inside Peiper's doomed pocket. And as a professional soldier, he did not just listen, he observed, and what he saw would tell him more about the state of the German army than Peiper's 7-hour lecture ever could. Major McCown was a prisoner, but he was also a professional soldier, and as he was moved around the shrinking German perimeter at Stoumont over the next 3 days, he kept his eyes and ears open. He was effectively a one-man intelligence-gathering operation trapped deep inside the enemy's most critical position. What he saw in those 72 hours completely contradicted the 7-hour fantasy monologue Peiper had delivered. Peiper's words had painted a picture of a resurgent, victorious Germany. The reality McCown observed was one of systemic, catastrophic collapse. The first thing he noticed was the German soldiers themselves. They looked utterly, profoundly exhausted. This was not the normal fatigue of battle. It was a deep, hollowed-out weariness. Their faces were gray and gaunt under several days' growth of beard, their eyes bloodshot and sunk deep in their sockets. They moved slowly, like old men, their shoulders slumped under the weight of their gear. They were also freezing. McCown noticed that many, perhaps even most, of the German soldiers were wearing parts of American uniforms. They wore American knit caps, American gloves, American wool sweaters, and, most prized of all, American rubber overshoes. Some had even stripped American overcoats from captured stockpiles or from the dead. It was a very confusing look, fashion-wise, like your enemy showed up to the fight wearing your own clothes, but the implication was devastating. The elite 1st SS Panzer Division, Hitler's personal bodyguard, the best-equipped unit in the German military, could not even provide its men with adequate winter clothing. Their logistics system had so completely failed that they were forced to loot the enemy just to stay warm. The cold was physical, relentless presence. It made the triggers of their rifles feel like sharp icicles, and the simple act of loading a magazine was a clumsy, painful ordeal with numb fingers. McCown saw men huddled together in cellars, their breath pluming in the frigid air, their bodies shivering uncontrollably. The ground was frozen solid, making it almost impossible to dig proper foxholes, so they piled up rubble and furniture in a desperate attempt to create cover. Then there was the food. The German supply system was not just failing, it was non-existent. McCown watched German soldiers eating, and they were all eating captured American food. They were still working their way through the K-rations and C-rations they had captured days earlier at Billingen or from overrun American positions. Why, they were treating these standard-issue, monotonous field rations like a Michelin-starred meal, savoring every last bite of the canned ham and eggs, hoarding the chocolate bars and cigarettes like gold. McCown saw no sign of any German field kitchens. There was no hot soup, no fresh bread, nothing. The German army in this pocket was running entirely on captured American calories. But the most horrifying and damning observation was the medical situation. The German aid station was set up in the dark, frigid cellar of a blasted-out house. McCown saw it briefly as he was being moved. The air was thick and foul, a stomach-turning miasma of unwashed bodies, old, coppery-smelling blood, and the faint, sweet, putrid odor of gangrene. Men lay shoulder to shoulder on straw spread over the cold stone floor, their bodies jerking in spasms of pain. He heard a man screaming, a high, thin animal sound that was cut off by a gasp. He saw a surgeon, his hands caked in blood, working by the weak, flickering light of a single lantern. The most shocking thing was the total lack of supplies. There was no morphine. There were no sulfa drugs to stop infection. Bandages were nothing more than dirty rags, washed in cold, gray water and then reused, still damp, on the next man. McCown saw an amputation being performed. The wounded soldier was fully conscious, his face slick with sweat, biting down on a thick leather strap while 4 of his comrades physically held him down on a table. The surgeon was using a simple carpenter's saw. The sound of it, the wet, rasping zip, 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 as it cut through bone, was a sound McCown knew he would never forget. American medical practice would consider that medieval, something you read about from the Civil War. American aid stations, even under pressure, were stocked with morphine syrettes, plasma, sulfa powder, and sterile bandages. American wounded received pain relief. The Germans, it seemed, had nothing. Historians still debate the supply priorities of the Waffen-SS, but in Peiper's pocket, the collapse was total. The lack of medical supplies meant that men with survivable wounds were dying horribly from shock, exposure, and infection. McCown, making precise mental notes, understood. An army that cannot feed its soldiers, cannot clothe its soldiers, and cannot even provide basic morphine for its wounded is not a winning army. It is a dying one. Peiper's words were just noise. This, the cold, the hunger, and the sound of that saw, was the truth. The final flickering ember of hope for the trapped Kampfgruppe was extinguished on December 22nd. Sometime in the afternoon, the men heard a sound they had been praying for, the drone of friendly aircraft engines. 6 Luftwaffe transport planes appeared, flying low and fast through the gray, overcast sky, braving the American anti-aircraft fire. Parachutes blossomed beneath them, dangling large supply canisters. For a moment, a desperate cheer might have risen from the German throats. Supplies, ammunition, food, and most importantly, medical supplies for the screaming men in the cellar. But their hope turned instantly to black despair. The drop zone was supposed to be the small, shrinking perimeter held by Peiper, but the pilots, either through poor navigation or intense ground fire, missed. The German soldiers watched in agony as the canisters, their only lifeline, drifted lazily down and landed squarely outside their perimeter, hundreds of yards away, directly into the waiting hands of the Americans. It was a complete and total failure. The Luftwaffe's aim was about as good as their long-term strategic planning at this point. That was the end. There would be no rescue, no resupply. They were now completely isolated. They had no fuel. They had almost no ammunition. The food was running out, and the medical situation was a medieval nightmare. Peiper's Kampfgruppe, the most powerful armored spearhead in the German army, was now just a collection of starving, freezing men, 170 American prisoners, and hundreds of their own wounded, all surrounded by an enemy that was growing stronger by the hour. On December 23rd, Peiper held a final conference with his senior officers. Major Hal McCown was brought in, a silent, observant witness to the death throes of the 1st SS Panzer Division. The German officers gathered in the same cold, map-strewn room where Peiper had delivered his monologue. The atmosphere now was utterly different. The fanatical confidence was gone, replaced by a grim, exhausted realism. McCown listened as they debated their options. Every option was bad. They could not advance, they had no fuel, they could not defend their position indefinitely, they had no ammunition, they could not retreat with their vehicles, they had no fuel. This left only one desperate, terrible choice. They could attempt to break out on foot. This would mean abandoning everything, every tank, every half-track, every vehicle, all of their heavy weapons. It would also mean abandoning the wounded who could not walk, and it would mean leaving their 170 American prisoners behind. Peiper made the decision. Break out on foot. They would destroy their vehicles to prevent them from falling into American hands. They would leave their own wounded in the cellars, along with the few captured American medical supplies they had, in the hopes the advancing Americans would treat them. They would release McCown and the other American prisoners, and then the remaining 800 or so able-bodied men would march east through the dense, snow-covered forests and try to walk back to the German lines. It was the only option that gave his men any chance of survival, a humiliating end to a mission that had begun with such arrogant confidence. The breakout began in the pitch blackness of 0200 hours, 2 in the morning on December 24th. The 800 German soldiers moved out like ghosts. The only sounds were the crunch of their boots in the deep snow, the rustle of their uniforms, and the low, whispered commands. It was freezing, the air so cold it burned their lungs. The darkness under the dense pines of the Ardennes was absolute, a disorienting, frigid void. Before they left, German engineers did their best to sabotage their own equipment. They placed demolition charges inside the breeches of the tank guns and tossed grenades into the engine compartments. They abandoned 7 of the monstrous King Tiger tanks at L'Église, 50 medium tanks, Panthers and Panzerfees, 70 half-tracks, and over 100 other vehicles. An entire armored division's worth of the most advanced military hardware in the world, left to rust in a Belgian wood, immobilized not by American guns, but by an empty gasoline can. Historians still debate Peiper's decision. Some see it as a soldier's duty to save his men, others as a fanatical refusal to surrender that needlessly cost more lives. In the chaos of the breakout, as the Germans slipped into the forest, Major Hal McCown and the other American prisoners were released. McCown did not wait. He made his way through the darkness back toward the American lines. He was rescued on Christmas Day, December 25th, exhausted and half-frozen, but alive, and he immediately filed an after-action report detailing everything he had seen. The German supply conditions, their equipment, their morale, the catastrophic failure of their food and medical systems. His report was a detailed first-hand intelligence document proving the German army was not just beaten, it was broken. Peiper's men, meanwhile, were on a desperate trek back to Germany, which was probably not the vacation itinerary they had been promised. Peiper's escape on foot was a tactical footnote, but it was a perfect symbol for the entire offensive. The most advanced armored unit in the world had been reduced to a freezing, disorganized rabble of infantry, their multi-million-dollar war machines left behind as scrap metal. While they were stumbling through the snow, other German commanders were already facing the consequences of this strategic failure. In January 1945, in a prisoner of war camp in France, General der Panzertruppe Hasso von Manteuffel sat in a bare, cold interrogation room. The room was probably a converted schoolhouse or office, and the chill was a damp, penetrating cold that came right through the walls. It smelled of stale cigarette smoke, wet wool, and the faint chemical scent of disinfectant. Manteuffel was the commander of the 5th Panzer Army, which had formed the center of the Ardennes attack. He was a professional, an old-school Prussian aristocrat, and an Eastern Front veteran who knew, in precise, agonizing detail, what it meant to fight a war without supplies. American intelligence officers, bundled in their own warm uniforms, asked him detailed questions. What were the objectives? What resources were allocated? What, in his professional opinion, went wrong? Manteuffel, his career over and the war clearly lost, answered with blunt, clinical honesty. There was no reason to lie anymore. His answers would become part of the official historical record. He explained that he and Field Marshal Model, his superior, had argued against Hitler's grandiose plan from the very beginning. Then they knew it was impossible. They had proposed a much more limited offensive, a small solution aimed at just pinching out the American salient and inflicting casualties, but Hitler wanted Antwerp. He wanted to cross the Meuse River, split the Allied armies, and force a political negotiation. It was a strategic fantasy, completely detached from the reality on the ground. The single biggest, most glaring flaw, Manteuffel explained, was fuel. The allocation of 5 million gallons of gasoline for 3 entire armies, with over 1,400 tanks and thousands of support vehicles, was not just insufficient. It was a mathematical impossibility. It was a joke, a very, very bad German joke. Manteuffel said his own tank units in the center of the advance were crying for fuel as early as December 19th. That was just the 3rd day of the offensive. Units were already grinding to a halt, their panzers sitting immobilized on the muddy roads, waiting for gasoline that would never, ever arrive. The entire plan, he told the shocked interrogators, was explicitly based on the assumption that they would capture American fuel depots. Peiper's success at Billingen was a lucky break, not a plan. You cannot, Manteuffel stated, base a major military operation on the hope that your enemy will be incompetent enough to just leave their supplies lying around for you. That is not strategy. That is desperation. But the American interrogators asked him to go broader. What about German logistics in general? Manteuffel was frank. German logistics had not just failed in the Ardennes. They had completely collapsed, and they had been collapsing for years. The Eastern Front, he explained, had destroyed the German logistical system. The vast distances, the terrible roads, the brutal winters, and the sheer grinding attrition had bled the Wehrmacht white. And the German army, the inventors of Blitzkrieg or Lightning War, had a secret. By 1944, it was no longer a modern mechanized army. It had become fatally dependent on horses, hundreds of thousands of horses. Manteuffel pointed out the absurd, fatal contradiction. By late 1944, many German infantry divisions had more horses in them than German divisions in World War I. They were fighting a 20th century mechanized war using 19th century horse-drawn logistics. The panzer divisions, like Peiper's, would break through, their tanks roaring ahead at 20 kilometers an hour. But their food, their ammunition, and their critical supplies were following behind them in wooden wagons pulled by starving horses, moving at maybe 5 kilometers an hour on a good day. The combat units constantly outran their own logistics and then inevitably stopped dead. They were immobilized, waiting for supplies that were days, not hours, behind them. And the horses created their own logistical nightmare. A single division with 5,000 horses needed 50 tons of fodder, of horse food, every single day. That fodder had to be transported on the same roads that were already choked with tanks, trucks, and artillery. The horses died by the thousands from exhaustion, from American air attacks, and from starvation. Their frozen, bloated carcasses blocked the roads, adding to the traffic jams and creating a horrific, pervasive stench of rot, even in the freezing cold. The Wehrmacht in 1944 was basically a giant traveling circus that smelled terrible and was being strafed by P-47s. Historians still debate whether Hitler's small solution and the one Manteuffel and Model proposed could have succeeded. It might have inflicted a heavier tactical defeat on the Americans, but it would not have changed the strategic outcome. The core problem remained. Manteuffel, sitting in that cold room, contrasted this medieval system with what he had seen of the Americans. American logistics used trucks, exclusively, hundreds of thousands of them, all standardized, all with interchangeable parts. Trucks, he noted wryly, did not need to be fed 20 pounds of hay every day. They did not get sick. They did not die of exhaustion. They just sat idle, consuming nothing until you filled them with gasoline, and then they moved faster than any horse ever could. Germany lost the war, Manteuffel concluded, long before the Ardennes offensive even began. Manteufel's blunt assessment was not an exaggeration. The American truck fleet was a marvel of the world. The famous Red Ball Express, a massive nonstop truck convoy system that ran across France, had supplied the entire Allied advance from the Normandy beaches. It was staffed largely by African-American soldiers who drove day and night on roads that were often still under threat to keep the front line moving. American industry had pumped out hundreds of thousands of standardized 2.5-ton trucks, the legendary Deuce and a Half, a vehicle so rugged, so reliable, and so ubiquitous that it became the very symbol of American logistical might. When an American truck broke down, a maintenance crew arrived, unbolted the broken part, and bolted on a new, identical part from a massive stockpile of spares. When a German truck broke down, which it did constantly, it was often a unique model from a pre-war Czech or French factory, and its spare parts simply did not exist. The vehicle was often just pushed into a ditch and abandoned. While German supply columns were being pulled by half-starved horses, American supply columns were a roaring 24-hour highway of gasoline-powered abundance. And then there was the air. Allied strategic bombing, Manteuffel explained, had systematically murdered the German logistical network. Every rail junction in Germany and occupied France was a target. Every bridge had been destroyed and rebuilt and destroyed again. Every road during daylight hours was a death trap. American P-47 Thunderbolts and British Typhoons, a type of pilot the Germans called Jabos or fighter bombers, roamed the skies with impunity. The sound of their engines was a terrifying high-pitched whine that sent German soldiers diving for cover. They attacked anything that moved, a single fuel truck, a lone supply wagon, even a soldier on a motorcycle. They turned German supply lines into a smoking, burning junkyard. This meant German logistics could only move at night in the pitch black with no headlights. It cut their efficiency by 90%. German factories, though still producing tanks and ammunition under Albert Speer's frantic direction, could not get those supplies to the front. The new tanks sat on rail cars in Germany, waiting for a bridge to be repaired, only for the rail yard itself to be obliterated by a 1,000-bomber raid. The smell of a bombed-out rail yard was a unique, sickening perfume of pulverized coal, shattered steel, and cordite. It was the smell of total industrial defeat. This was the system that was supposed to support Hitler's grand offensive. It was a fantasy. This reality was understood by professional officers like Manteuffel. But the Ardennes offensive was not just run by professionals. Peiper's ultimate commander, the man in charge of the entire 6th SS Panzer Army, was SS Oberstgruppenführer Josef Sepp Dietrich, and Dietrich was the polar opposite of Manteuffel. Dietrich was an old Nazi, one of Hitler's original brawling street fighters from the 1920s. He had been a butcher, and then Hitler's personal bodyguard and chauffeur. He was promoted far, far beyond his actual military competence because of his personal loyalty to Hitler. Even Hermann Göring, himself not exactly a military genius, once said that Dietrich was decent but stupid and had at most the ability to command a division. Hitler had given him an entire panzer army, the main striking force of the whole offensive. The results were predictable. Dietrich's army was supposed to lead the main thrust, break through, and capture Antwerp. Instead, it bogged down almost immediately, creating the colossal traffic jams right behind Peiper's spearhead. The planning was abysmal. The coordination was non-existent. Dietrich, a man of simple, brutal courage, understood nothing of logistics, of supply, of the complex orchestration required to move 100,000 men and their machines. He just understood pushing forward. When forward was blocked, he had no other ideas. Historians still debate how much Dietrich's incompetence contributed to the failure versus the impossible plan itself. It was a perfect storm of a delusional plan being executed by an incompetent royalist. In February 1946, while awaiting his own war crimes trial at Nuremberg, Dietrich was interviewed by an American psychiatrist. Dietrich, with a kind of gallows humor, made a sardonic comment about his command. He said, "We called ourselves the 6th Panzer Army because we have only got 6 panzers left." It was a dark, bitter joke, but it was also the literal truth. The offensive had completely destroyed his army. His command, like Peiper's, was allocated fuel for about 90 to 100 miles of travel. The distance to Antwerp was 140 miles, and that was on a straight line, not accounting for detours or combat. The plan, like Peiper's, explicitly required capturing American fuel, and the entire operation was a house of cards, built on a foundation of desperate hope and profound logistical ignorance. Dietrich, the true believer, represented Hitler's fatal flaw. The belief that sheer will, fanaticism, and Aryan courage could overcome material reality. Manteuffel, the professional, represented the truth. Will and courage are useless when your tank is out of gas. In April 1945, with Germany in its final agonizing death throes, Joachim Peiper sat in another bare, cold room, this time as a prisoner of war. American interrogators questioned him about his role in the offensive, his unit's operations, and the decisions he had made. The room was quiet, the only sounds being the scraping of a pencil on a notepad and the distant muffled sounds of a functioning American military base. The air smelled of damp wool and the faint, dusty scent of old paper files. Peiper was cooperative, professional, and detached. The war was over. He was a soldier answering questions from other soldiers. They asked him about the fuel crisis. When did he run out? Where did he refuel? What depots did he capture? Peiper explained the situation in detail, the capture of Bullingen, the 50,000 gallons that got him to Stavelot. And then, he explained, he found no major depot at Stavelot. He found only small scattered caches, not enough to matter. He continued west with what little fuel he had until he reached Stoumont, where he ran completely, irrevocably dry. One of the American interrogators, likely working from Major McCown's debriefing and reports from the engineers who had secured the depot, asked him a direct question. Did he know about the 2 million gallons of gasoline just 300 yards north of his route at Stavelot? Peiper said he did not. The interrogator then unrolled a map and showed him, and he pointed to the road Peiper's column had used. And then he pointed to the secondary road just 800 feet away where the depot had been. He explained that thousands upon thousands of jerry cans were stacked in plain sight along that road. Peiper had passed within yards of enough fuel to take him to Antwerp and back. Peiper, a man who had seen everything, a man who was about to be tried for his life for the massacre of American prisoners at Malmedy, looked at the map for a long, quiet moment. Then he looked up, shrugged slightly, and said in his perfect English, "I am sorry." The interrogator asked him why he had missed it. Peiper's answer was the key to the entire battle, the entire war. He said he expected the fuel to be concentrated in the town square, piled up, just like it had been at Bullingen. When he did not find it there, he assumed the Americans had evacuated it. He never, ever thought to look for millions of gallons of fuel just stacked by the side of a road. He missed it because he was looking for a German depot. He was looking for organized infrastructure, for buildings, for guards, for something that looked permanent and formal. The American depot was just fuel, ready, abundant, and flexible. That single devastating error, born from a failure to understand the sheer scale and different philosophy of American logistics, was the war in miniature. The German army was looking for something that did not exist. They were looking for a conventional limited war, and they found themselves in a total war of industrial production they could not possibly win. The K-ration, the little brown box that Peiper had examined in Bullingen, was the true symbol of this reality. It was not just a meal, it was a message. It was a tangible piece of evidence that German soldiers could hold in their hands, a message that told them why they were losing. That small box represented an industrial capacity that Germany, even at its peak, had never possessed. Factories 3,000 miles away, completely safe from bombing, were churning out 90 million of these meals a month. It represented a logistical network that could ship those boxes across a hostile ocean and deliver them to a single soldier in a foxhole in Belgium. And it represented an economy of such overwhelming abundance that it could afford to include luxuries like real chocolate, real coffee, cigarettes, and chewing gum as standard issue for every soldier. German rations by 1944 were a reflection of a collapsing system. Ersatz coffee, rock-hard bread, fatty meat, irregular distribution, and a total dependence on field kitchens that could often not reach the front. American rations, even the ones GIs complained about, were a reflection of a functioning dominant system. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, many Wehrmacht soldiers were literally starving. Their supply systems had completely disintegrated. There is a strange and telling fact that many German prisoners of war actually gained weight in American captivity. They were fed regularly with food that was nutritious, and they were often getting more calories as prisoners than they had been getting as active-duty soldiers in Hitler's army. The Battle of the Bulge ended in January 1945. The German forces were pushed back, their last strategic reserves completely shattered. The offensive had cost them 100,000 casualties and over 600 tanks and assault guns they could never replace. It had delayed the final Allied push into Germany by about 6 weeks, but it had not and could not change the final outcome of the war. Tactics mattered, strategy mattered, leadership and courage mattered. But logistics, the vast, unglamorous mathematical business of supply, provided the foundation for everything else. An army without adequate supplies cannot execute tactics, no matter how brilliant its soldiers. It cannot implement strategy, no matter how bold its generals. Germany lost because it was outproduced, outshipped, and outsupplied. The K-ration did not win the war. But it was the profit of that victory. And so our story tonight, a story of a vast and terrible battle, comes to a quiet close. It is fascinating, isn't it, how the largest movements of history, the clash of great armies and the fates of nations can hinge on things so small. A tiny waxed cardboard box, a stack of fuel cans missed by only a few hundred yards. A cold soldier savoring a piece of chocolate. The great roaring engines of the panzers fell silent, their power useless, defeated not by a superior tank, but by an empty fuel gauge. The grand strategies of dictators and generals dissolved into the simple, desperate reality of hunger and cold. It is a reminder that behind all the maps, the arrows, and the thunder of the guns, war is a brutal, grinding problem of logistics. It is a problem of supply. Tonight, we saw how an army, even a brilliant and terrifying one, can be brought to its knees by the simple, overwhelming abundance of its enemy. The K-ration was a symbol, a message of a world that had already changed, a world of industrial power that Germany could no longer compete with. But now, that history is quiet. The forests of the Ardennes are peaceful once more. The echoes of the engines long faded. The story is told and the night is deep. It is time now to let go of these heavy thoughts, to let the noise of the past fade into the silence. It is time to rest. Close your eyes. Let the darkness be a comfort and a quiet blanket. Thank you for spending this time with me. All that is left to do now is drift away. Good night.